What a life it was. Our Torah portion, Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah, of our matriarch. And we pick up the Torah portion at the very end of her life, and she's passed away after a lifetime of 127 years. It's a longevity that any of us would take and embrace. And as Rashi says in a very, very famous comment on the verse, on the first verse of our Torah portion, she lived for 127 years. Rashi says, Kulan shavin letova, that they were all equal in their goodness, in terms of how good they were. It's a very perplexing comment, because looking at Sarah's life, it wasn't easy. Her first 90 years, all she wanted, her dreams to have a family, to have a child, and only at the age of 90 she had Isaac. And all of the challenges with Hagar and Yishmael, and the displacement and leaving their home and reestablishing themselves, and being captured and kidnapped, and all of that in Sarah's life. And yet Rashi says that all of her years were equally good. There are many ways to understand this. There's a way to understand that the goodness was in her perspective, not in the objective reality of her life, but rather in her perspective, that even when things weren't going her way, she maintained a good outlook, a good perspective. Maybe it's talking about her character, that regardless of whether she was down on her luck or in good times, that she always maintained a solid character of goodness. She was equally good. Not that her years were good, but that she was equally good. There's a fascinating midrash, a fascinating teaching, which begins and takes us to the book of Esther, to the story of Purim. And it says, Esther marries Achashverosh, becomes the queen. Achashverosh rules over no less than 127 Medinot, 127 provinces is what Achashverosh rules over. So Esther then, when she becomes the queen, becomes entrusted with the leadership and ruling 127 different provinces. That's a number associated with Esther. And the Midrash says that Rabbi Akiva was talking one day, and the great Rabbi Akiva was teaching, and he said, why was Esther entrusted with 127 provinces? It connects it to Sarah, who lived for 127 years. There has to be more to it. That was the teaching of Rabbi Akiva, to connect the life of Sarah with the leadership of Esther, and there has to be more to it. And perhaps what's there is more than just saying Esther was a descendant of Sarah, and therefore this was 127 and that was 127. And perhaps there's more in understanding the reality of where was this teaching being presented. Rabbi Akiva. When Rabbi Akiva lived? In time of great oppression, great suffering for the Jewish people. And Rabbi Akiva was teaching his students who were living through these terrible times. And he had to give them a message of hope. What's the message of hope contained within this connection between Sarah and Esther? Esther lived many, many generations after Sarah. And what's implied is that one is a reward for the other. Because Sarah was so good, her descendant was blessed with such royalty and with such grandeur. In the merit of Sarah's actions, her descendant Esther was so fortunate. And maybe that's a word of comfort, that reward for our deeds isn't immediate. That's not the way we understand that when the Talmud teaches us that if we give a tithe, if we give charity, then we'll become wealthy ourselves. It's not that you put a penny into the tzedakah box and suddenly you have a $100 bill sitting in your pocket that you didn't know about before. It's not that reward is immediate, that if I help someone, then I'll be rewarded right away. That's not what it's about. Reward comes, but it comes on God's schedule, not on ours. And sometimes something that Sarah did in her lifetime can only be seen as being rewarded many, many, many generations later. And that's a word of comfort that Rabbi Akiva gave to his students, and that's a word of comfort that we give to ourselves and to our generation when times are tough, when there are challenges, when we look around and we see that the winds are shifting and that things are changing and that there's discourse out there and that There's anti-Semitism out there that we didn't see before, or maybe wasn't as prevalent, or maybe was hiding for a while, and now it's out there and we're noticing it and we're feeling threatened. And we look at all of that and we look at the darkness that exists in the world and we say, but the good, where's the reward? God, aren't we being faithful? Aren't we trying our best? And the answer that Rabbi Akiva comforted his students with, who were going through unimaginably difficult times that have repeated themselves again and again throughout Jewish history, and thankfully, and we're so grateful that our problems pale in comparison to the problems that have existed and to the threats that have existed in Jewish history. But what Rabbi Akiva comforted his students with, we comfort ourselves with as well, that you never know. The reward for a good deed, we can't sit back and wait for it, but it's always there, and it's always coming. We just never know when it'll arrive. We just know that we and our families, please God, will one day benefit and be rewarded for the good deeds that are performed. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom.